Hi, I'm Henry Jenneret, and my presentation today will be on the 1940 Disney film Fantasia. Now, you may recognize this picture of Mickey in this little costume he has on. It's probably one of the most popular images we see of Mickey Mouse. Maybe you grew up seeing it. He's the Sorcerer's Apprentice, and this is probably the most famous part of Fantasia. And Fantasia is a movie made up of short animated films like The Sorcerer's Apprentice that are all set to classical music. But before we get into that, we have to go back to the usage of music and sound in movies in general. So in the beginning of cinema, films were silent. If there was dialogue in a movie, it wouldn't be spoken, it would be written on the screen in sort of title cards. But the experience wasn't silent for the audience. There would be a piano player to accompany the picture, and usually they would play classical music. And this was for two reasons. One, it's a little bit recognizable. The audience is perhaps a little familiar with it. And moreover, number two, it's in the public domain, so there's no worrying about copyrights or royalty fees or anything like that. So from the very beginning of film, one of the big questions was, okay, how do we have film and sound play at the same time? And so a sound on film process took a while. And in 1927, a movie, or what was now being called a talkie, The Jazz Singer, comes out, starring Al Jolson, a major star at the time who, like many of his contemporaries, performed in blackface. And this film transformed the industry. But for a while, it's still considered a novelty, and many other filmmakers struggled to catch up with this new phenomenon. So we go forward a bit to 1928, and we have a young filmmaker named Walt Disney. He's down on his luck. His distributor hired away almost all of his staff. He's no longer able to use a star character that he has, but he and his staff, mostly of iWorks, they created a new guy, a little mouse, who they eventually decided to call Mickey. Now, Mickey's not very unique. He's not really any different from his contemporaries. They're all just based off these blackface minstrel tropes. So what makes Mickey stand out from the crowd? For a while, nothing. He wasn't even in the crowd because Disney failed to get a distributor. But Walt Disney saw The Jazz Singer, and he knew that sound was going to be the next big thing. Sound and animation had been done before, but not very successfully, and Disney, being very strong-willed, makes it happen, and the company creates a short called Steamboat Willie. And we see this little clip of Steamboat Willie play before Disney movies nowadays. Steamboat Willie is erroneously known as the first sound-synchronized cartoon. However, it is an early example of very successful sound synchronization for sure. The movements lined up so well with motions, and moreover, what's unique about it is that the music was used as an integral part of telling the story. So immediately, it was a big hit, and then from the success with the Mickey Mouse series, Disney started another series alongside it called The Silly Symphonies. And The Silly Symphonies wasn't just music telling the story, it was really music as the basis for the story, and the animation is what accompanied it. So it wasn't just the slapstick of Mickey Mouse, but it was, Walt Disney described it as, sheer fantasy unfolds, action controlled by a musical pattern, has great charm in the realm of unreality, unquote. And it was widely successful. It's actually tied with Tom and Jerry for the most Academy Awards for an animated short film. But by the mid-1930s, Mickey Mouse wasn't so popular, and he really needed a comeback. So Walt Disney has this idea to have Mickey Mouse star in a Silly Symphony short based on Paul Dukas' The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Now, story has it that Walt Disney just so happens to go out to dinner and bumps into Leopold Stokowski. Stokowski was the conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra at the time, and he's really, really, really famous. He's made many appearances in movies at the time as himself, and he's dated icons of the 30s like Greta Garbo, married Gloria Vanderbilt. He's a big deal and a celebrity in his own right. And so Walt Disney and Leopold Stokowski start talking, and Disney mentions The Sorcerer's Apprentice. And Stokowski says, I would love to conduct that for you. For one thing, how do you say no to Stokowski? The name of Stokowski alone would certainly boost Mickey's great comeback. So Disney and Stokowski team up for this project together, and Stokowski provides his services for free. Now, the two had a lot of faith in this project, and Walt was very excited about the whole thing. So much so that the costs went up so high that they were 3 to 4 times the cost of a typical Silly Symphony short, so they would never make a profit off this short alone. Stokowski believes that this is really the start of something major, so they figure, well, why don't we make this into a full-length picture? And so they do. They call it the concert feature, and it's essentially this wonderful animated concert. So Stokowski comes on as a full musical advisor, and he very meticulously picks all these wonderful pieces with Walt Disney, and they also bring in Deems Taylor. His opera, The King's Henchman, was the first American opera to be performed at the Met, and he was also well known at the time for his work in radio, particularly as an intermission commentator with the New York Philharmonic Symphony. And so he becomes the master of ceremonies for this new film, which they decided to call Fantasia. Now, Disney was always an artistic innovator, always seeking to push limits. With their master of sound like Stokowski, with this masterpiece in which the main thing of importance is the music, Disney knew he had to do something about the element of sound in Fantasia. Sound at the time was mono sound, so if you were listening to a recording, it wouldn't be the same you would hear in a concert hall. So for Fantasia, they actually recorded 9 separate soundtracks so that they were able to achieve a much wider dynamic range and a wider frequency range. And more importantly, with creating 9 separate soundtracks, they were able to create stereophonic sound with surround sound. So this became the first commercial film to use stereo sound, surround sound. And at the time, they marketed it as Fantasound. So essentially, the sounds you would hear in the movie is essentially the same thing you would hear if you were seeing Stokowski and the Philadelphia Orchestra play in a concert hall, and it was magnificent. So with that, I'd love to show you some clips from the movie. I couldn't do a better job of introducing this picture than Deems Taylor, so I'll just let him speak for himself.
What you're going to see are the designs and pictures and stories that music inspired in the minds and imaginations of a group of artists. In other words, these are not going to be the interpretations of trained musicians, which I think is all to the good. Now, there are 3 kinds of music on this Fantasia program. First, there's the kind that tells a definite story. Then there's the kind that, while it has no specific plot, does paint a series of more or less definite pictures. Then there's a third kind, music that exists simply for its own sake.
So we'll begin with the first segment, which is Toccata and Fugue in D minor, which was originally written for the organ by the best, Johann Sebastian Bach, around 1710, give or take about 10 years or so. You may recognize the tune by its opener, which I'll play a quick clip of as performed by Kevin MacLeod. And Taylor describes this segment as abstract images that might pass through your mind if you sat in a concert hall listening to this music, unquote. The visuals for this segment heighten Stokowski's arrangements through the usage of space and light and all these different colors for representing different sounds, for what the Disney company described the experience as, quote-unquote, seeing music and hearing pictures. Next is the Nutcracker Suite. The Nutcracker is one of Tchaikovsky's most famous pieces. He was commissioned to compose it for a Russian ballet in 1892, which we now know is performed all the time by dance companies, especially around Christmas time. This suite is a collection of 8 of the pieces from the ballet with melodies you may recognize, such as The Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy, which you will hear in the following clip. And of course, the one that started it all, The Sorcerer's Apprentice. This was composed by Paul Dukas in 1897, which itself was adapted from an old poem by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Also, just a warning, there is a flashing light sequence in this. It starts at around the 11-minute mark and finishes at around the 11:30-minute mark. So just, if you want to skip ahead, those are the times to do so, roughly. The only piece by a living composer in Fantasia, living at the time the movie was created, that uh, is Igor Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. It's from a ballet of the same name, which actually caused a riot at its 1913 premiere. In the film, the Rite of Spring sequence depicts something a bit controversial in America for its time: Darwin's evolutionary theory. This is followed by a more silly symphonies-esque segment, the piece being Beethoven's The Pastoral Symphony. This next segment is more of a comical piece, and you'll see why in a moment. But it was especially in this piece that the animators appreciated just how magnificent ballet is, because, like animation, it is an art form that is based all through movement. From Amilcare Ponchielli's 1876 opera La Gioconda, this is Dance of the Hours. The final sequence is a combination of two juxtaposing pieces, Night on Bald Mountain, a tone poem by Modesta Mussorgsky written around 1867, and Schubert's 1825 arrangement of the classic Ave Maria with a new text by Rachel Field, which gives a beautiful, peaceful ending to the film, which unfortunately will not be featured in this next clip. Instead, for the sake of time, will be just featuring Night on Bald Mountain. The film itself is really one of reflection and, in some ways, also commentary. It's commentary in the sense that the Disney company recognizes that classical music is this great high art, a bit hoity-toity and elitist. And so there's this part where these bells clash. And it's not to say, oh, look at these silly, careless musicians. It's more, hey, this is what happens in live performances. That's showbiz. And having that little gag, while it doesn't belittle this fantastic art form, it does attempt to dim down the pretentiousness associated with it. Moreover, it's a reflection of the market. We live in a capitalistic society, and Walt Disney, a staunch capitalist, he knows he has to respond to what the market will bear. And his original intention with making Fantasia a full-length film was to re-release it every year, adding numbers, cutting some others, and responding to what the market wants, so every year people could go and see a new Fantasia. This didn't end up happening, but they did end up changing a major part of the movie in re-releases. For example, in the Pastoral Symphony, there's these very blatant African-American caricatures that are featured a great deal throughout the piece, among other stereotypes throughout the film. In 1940, these sort of characters were unfortunately quite common. Animation was an outgrowth of vaudeville, which itself was the result of blackface minstrel shows. So these caricatures were quite common. But by 1969, the revolutionary efforts of the civil rights movement, and not to mention the censoring and banning of other racist cartoons from around the time of Fantasia, the Disney company realized this is not something the market will want. So they pretty much erased these caricatures from the re-release, and it's essentially been forgotten about. This reminds us that Fantasia is not this pure, timeless classic. It's very much a movie that is a reflection of its time, and that needs to be unpacked in respect to not sweeping this racism under the rug and pretending it never happened. But ultimately, we know today that Fantasia has seen massive success. However, like other Disney movies of this time, like Pinocchio and Bambi, it took actually quite a long time to achieve that success. As discussed earlier, the first intended purpose of Fantasia was financial. They couldn't make any return on The Sorcerer's Apprentice alone, so it would be more convenient and more financially savvy of them to expand this into a full picture. Their other intended purposes were to bring classical music to the masses and to do so in an artistically innovative way. But they struggled with the formula to successfully do so. Fantasia was very experimental and very artistically innovative and also very costly. They presented it in a really fascinating way. They did it as a roadshow, which basically means you have to buy your tickets in advance. They typically cost more, and they would show matinees and in the evening. And it would be a very full event. People would dress up. You would get a program for the event. Ushers were especially trained for this. And there were only about 16 prints of the film made. It was shown at about 12 theaters. And where it did run, like New York City and LA, it ran for a year, and it was critically acclaimed. Now, it was re-released over the years. It was re-released in 1946 to its original format, but it wasn't very successful, and then it was re-released again in 1956, a few years after Disney started his television series, and the year after the Disneyland theme park opened. So Disney was riding high on fame, and Fantasia started to become more popular. However, Fantasia didn't actually begin to turn a profit until it was re-released in 1969, which was really the perfect time to do it. With all the abstraction and with pop artists like Roy Lichtenstein and Andy Warhol at the front and center of pop culture, the public really liked it. Um, and another thing, Disney was billing this as the ultimate experience. So essentially, people would get high, not all the people who were seeing it, but a lot of people would get high and then go see Fantasia. And it was essentially this psychedelic experience for hippies. And so Fantasia expanded to an even greater, unprecedented populace than it had ever seen before. Now, Fantasia didn't become popular because of stoners and LSD enthusiasts. It was really a masterpiece in its own right. And it began this era of classical music and cartoons. Um, there were still people who thought that Fantasia was too highbrow. Um, One of those people was Chuck Jones of Warner Brothers. And so he made these parodies that became kind of known as the working class Fantasia. And personally, that's where I remember first learning a lot of classical music myself.
You know, it is so sad. All your knowledge of high culture comes from Bugs Bunny cartoons.
I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. It introduces classical music to a much broader audience, especially children, and there's no other film genre at this point that is more associated with classical music than animation. And yes, it's gimmicky and it's comical, there's no denying that, but it has still led to a much greater exposure and appreciation for classical music that wouldn't have existed without these cartoons. As a result of using these classic pieces in cartoons, there's been a plethora of concerts in which the projector will show these old Looney Tunes cartoons, and a live orchestra will play these iconic scores accompanying it with greats like Wagner and what have you. This has had a run on Broadway and is still done all the time. Similar concerts have been done with Fantasia, particularly with the release of Fantasia 2000. So there is certainly a great, genuine appreciation there. Something among the many things that makes music so meaningful to us is when we have memories we connect that music with. So for many people, when they hear classical music, they'll be reconnected with fond childhood memories of Mickey Mouse and Elmer Fudd, and I think that's a wonderful thing. In conclusion, Fantasia is a masterpiece that, while breaking new ground, reflected sentiments of its time. It took a while for Fantasia to be widely recognized as a masterpiece, but since its release, it has brought classical music to the masses in a wildly influential and unprecedented way. Thank you all so much for watching. I know this presentation is kind of a longer one, so I appreciate you all bearing with me. If any of the clips interested you, I'd recommend watching Fantasia or my personal favorite, its sequel, Fantasia 2000, which is more contemporary and more for a popular audience. Anyway, if you have any questions or comments or anything of the sort, I'd love to hear from you all. Thank you again for watching, and take good care.